I have a question to the publisher, the editors of the book. You are, how did you start the book? Did you first make a project yourself that you found was educational, educative, pedagogical? Is it based on a personal experience?
It started with a conversation over a drink. And the gist of it, the gist of that conversation was the proposition that the most interesting explorations of the question of education were happening outside of any institution of higher education. That if you wanted to find out what was at stake in the notion of education, that there was no point in talking to formal institutions of education because they'd long ago forfeited a huge amount of the critical function. And irrespective of what way you think they may or may not have served that in the past, but putting that to one side, just the recognition that something was happening multiply, and it was happening elsewhere, and that in some way attending to this might matter, that attending to this might matter, something might open up here. And I think that what surprised me initially in the first conversations we had in public around it was the resistance of participants within the mainstream art world to recognizing the proposition that there was some broadly pervasive engagement with multiple questions of the educational, the pedagogical, the collectivities who self-constituted around a question or a conversation that emerged from where they happened to be, to paraphrase some of the language that Annie and Sarah used in their piece. But the moment we started to open up that conversation, it became apparent that there was a lot more at stake in this than that initial kind of, intuition that there's something happening. But I think what really seized me was the consistent anxiety and resistance by practitioners to be recruited to anything which might be happening elsewhere as well. There's something about the reputational stakes of the contemporary art world which mean that you must disavow any kind of proximity to another. You must be sui generis, you must be absolutely specific, unique and differentiated. And it's absolutely treacherous for your personal stakes within this game if you are kind of acknowledging that you participate in something that's... And I mean, I'm being a bit bold, but I do think that was something that the resistance to the conversation, I thought that was remarkable. The resistance in a number of different constituencies, I thought that was interesting. But also the willful blindness of so much of the institutional discourses on education, specifically on curatorial education or art education, the willful blindness to the fact that they were no longer, if they ever had been, but they were no longer in charge of this conversation. I thought that was a really interesting thing as well. But Paul probably has a very different
take. I think there was a number of reasons for myself. One which was the failed manifesto school. Then education as one of these three leitmotifs of Documenta, so that maybe the kind of connection between two mega biennial type exhibition forms to have emerged during the last 6 years now. And also I think it also began on an argument between me and Mick, and that I had two things which one of many. There are probably two things which I've constantly employed as an aspect of my curatorial practice, and one is the idea of the open structure, and secondly is the idea of failure. And both of those things, the idea of the open structure which could constitute itself by the participants within production of the form, and also this idea of failure seem to be becoming increasingly corralled by a lot of discussions around the failed manifesto school and the emergent other projects such as United Nations Plaza, Night School, art school book, and I organised with, or was invited to do a project with Chanalte in Bristol for a project called Setting a Setting, and I decided not to chair the day's event and to see how that would be. And of course myself and Mick had a great argument about that because there was a certain resistance to the idea of openness, keeping things going, keeping things in flow, not foreclosing oneself, keeping the process in place, not coming up with any kind of conclusivity. So maybe there was that kind of contradiction, so there was those two things which began a discussion. Also, I think that, yeah, so that maybe was the beginning of the discussion, and I was doing a lot of research in relation to the curatorial field and studying the discourse around curating over the last 20 years, and Mick was doing a lot of research into alternative pedagogical, radical pedagogical theories, such as Ivan Illich and Paulo Freire, etc. So there was some kind of overlap in our thinking, but we were coming from very different perspectives. We both work in education. We both take our turns as being curators and artists and various other roles that one plays within an art worldly context. But I think that the corralling of a particular discourse around the idea of the educational as being formalised through the failure of Manifesto 6 and the players within that was very much a kind of a reason enough in itself to actually react against, to actually kind of look at and consider how that model, there's nothing new within it. The only thing that's new within it is the fact that it's mediating itself differently and it's constituting itself through the art world and its relationship with it, because it has the disseminational tools to do that, which is ebooks. And we were kind of a little bit concerned, I think we still are probably concerned, even though there are 3 texts which rethink or attempt to configure 3 different narratives around that project in the book, Ian Gillett, Tirdas Agakar and Anton Dopla, who was one of the initiators. And I think that there is still a concern for us around the discourse around kind of alternative pedagogical models in education as being corralled by that particular project and its relationship with the so-called international art world. And we wish to kind of configure and orientate that project and some of the discussions that were going on around it by people like Ira Rogoff, etc., in relation to preceding projects such as Proto Academy, Future Academy, Annie's project, Daniel Barem's project, and a whole raft of projects which have been going on in the UK, in Europe and beyond.